Jake Matthews was tired. After another week of traveling for work, all he wanted was to catch his flight home, arrive, and sleep for days. He walked absent-mindedly through the airport terminal, trying to find the boarding gate. The place was packed with crying children, people running around, and a loudspeaker constantly announcing flights. Typical airport chaos on a Friday afternoon. Laura, on the other hand, was excited. She had just finished a photography assignment in another city and was looking forward to showing the photos to her friends. While waiting for her flight, she walked calmly, admiring the movement and the artificial lights that created interesting shadows on the ground. Her keen photographer's eye was always capturing details that others missed. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed through the airport. It wasn't a normal sound, like a plane taking off or an announcement over the loudspeaker. It was a bang, followed by screams. Jake paused for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. People started running in the opposite direction, which made his stomach turn. Laura, who was near the food court, saw black smoke rising from an area near the boarding gates. Her instinct was to pull out her camera, but she soon realized that something was very wrong. The smell of burning was strong, and the smoke was rising rapidly. Someone shouted fire, and within seconds, panic set in. The fire alarm sounded loudly, and the emergency lights started flashing. Jake turned to run, following the crowd, but tripped over an abandoned suitcase on the way. He got up quickly, his heart racing, as he tried to find a way out. Laura ran away from the smoke, adrenaline taking over her body. She looked around and saw crying children, desperate parents and officials trying to organize the evacuation, without much success. Everything was confused and chaotic. Even so, Laura felt that there was something strange about the fire. It didn't look like a simple accident. As Jake struggled to make his way through the crowd, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a fast-moving, almost human shadow passing through the flames. He blinked, confused, but didn't have time to think too much. The smoke was getting thicker, and his only priority now was to get out of there as quickly as possible. Little did both Jake and Laura know that this fire would mark the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change their lives forever. They finally reached the emergency exit along with a small group of other passengers. By now, chaos was everywhere. Fire engines and ambulances were arriving, and the fire continued to grow, engulfing the airport little by little. Outside, the air seemed cooler, but the danger wasn't over yet. Something was very wrong, and that feeling of insecurity persisted, even away from the flames. The fire was only the beginning. Jake Matthews was still panting when he arrived outside the airport. The fresh air filled his lungs, but he could hardly think. The chaos inside the terminal had been swift and frightening, but the fire still didn't seem the worst part. Something else was wrong. He could feel it. Around him, other survivors were in shock. Some were crying, others screaming for help. Laura was among them. She moved a little away from the crowd, trying to understand what had happened. Her eyes were still stinging from the smoke, and her mind was a mess of thoughts. She mentally relived the scenes of the fire and couldn't forget the strange feeling she had before it all began. Nearby, a group of firefighters and paramedics were working quickly, helping anyone who needed it and trying to control the fire that continued to grow inside the airport. It was clear that the fire was still out of control. Jake watched, still not completely believing what had happened. He wondered how the fire had started. An accident? A short circuit? But then he remembered that strange shadow he had seen while running. What had that been? He wasn't sure, but he knew it couldn't be his imagination. As Jake turned away from the commotion to try to calm down, Lauren noticed him. She recognized the man as one of those who had also escaped from the terminal. Without thinking twice, she went over to him. "Did you see anything in there?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. Jake looked at her for a moment before answering, trying to process the question. "I saw it, I think. There was something besides fire," he said hesitantly. "Something that didn't make sense." Laura nodded. She couldn't explain it, but she'd had the same feeling. It wasn't just a fire. There was something else, a presence that seemed wrong. "I felt it too," Laura murmured. "It wasn't just the fire. It felt like there was something else going on. I don't know what, but it was scary." They were silent for a moment, both trying to find answers to something they couldn't understand. Around them, other survivors were beginning to calm down, but the tension in the air was still strong. Jake and Lara were soon approached by an emergency team who asked if they needed medical help. They both refused, saying they were fine physically, but the fear was still there firm. Later, an officer approached to speak to the group of survivors. He said that the fire was being investigated, but that they still didn't know the cause. It was a normal explanation, but Jake and Lara knew there was more behind it. When night fell, the area around the airport was covered in emergency lights, sirens, and the constant sound of firefighters at work. The airport was completely evacuated, but Jake and Lara realized that they didn't feel safe, even away from the flames. As they watched the chaos from afar, they knew that this fire was just the beginning of something much bigger. A few days after the fire, Jake Matthews was back to his normal routine, or at least he tried to. In his office, he sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, but his mind was far away. The memories of that day at the airport were still fresh. He tried not to think about the strange shadow he saw among the flames, but every time he closed his eyes, it came back. News of the fire was everywhere. The newspapers and television were talking about it, but no one knew the exact cause. Some said it was an electrical problem, others thought something more serious had happened. But for Jake, neither explanation seemed sufficient. He felt there was more behind it. At home, things weren't normal either. Ever since the fire, he had felt a strange presence, as if he were being watched. He lived alone, but every night he had the feeling that there was someone else in the house. The sound of creaking furniture and doors that he was sure he had closed appeared to be open. But he tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Meanwhile, Lara was also trying to get on with her life. After the fire, she went back to her small town and started reviewing the photos for the job. But as she was going through the images from the airport, something caught her eye. In one of the photos, taken moments before the fire, there was something in the background that seemed out of place. A blurry figure of someone she hadn't noticed before. The photo made her uneasy, and the feeling she had on the day of the fire came back strongly. Unable to forget what she had seen, Lara picked up the phone and tried to call Jake. They had exchanged phone numbers after what had happened at the airport, more as a way of keeping in touch in case of news about the fire. Jake answered after a few rings. "Hi Jake, it's Lara. Do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice a little nervous. "Sure, what's up?" he replied, curious. "I was reviewing some photos I took at the airport, and I think there's something strange about them. I can't explain it, but there's something that doesn't seem normal," Lara said, trying to find the right words. Jake was silent for a moment, remembering the shadow he himself had seen. He knew that Lara was probably seeing something similar. "I know what you're talking about," he finally said. "Ever since that day, I've felt something was wrong. It's not just the fire. There's something else." Lara agreed. They talked for a few more minutes, exchanging their experiences since the fire. They were both trying to get back to normal, but it seemed that something was holding them back. When he hung up, Jake sat on the sofa, thinking about the conversation. The feeling of being watched seemed worse now, as if someone or something was very close, just waiting for the right moment to appear. He got up, went to the window, and looked out, but there was nothing unusual. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had only just begun. Life seemed to have returned to normal, but Jake and Lauren knew that, in fact, nothing was normal. The fire had triggered something they still couldn't understand. That night, Jake Matthews had the worst nightmare of his life. He was back at the airport, with the sound of sirens echoing all around him. Flames danced around him, consuming everything. In the middle of the fire, he saw again the shadow that had frightened him on the day of the fire. This time, it was moving towards him slowly, as if waiting for him. Jake tried to run, but his legs wouldn't help him. The more he tried to run, the closer the shadow got. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, and looked around the dark room. He was alone, but the fear didn't go away. It was as if the nightmare had left something in the air, something that still followed him. He couldn't get back to sleep that night. The next morning, while he was having coffee, his phone rang. It was Lara. "Jake, you won't believe what's happened," she said, without even waiting for him to say hello. "What's wrong?" he asked, already feeling his stomach turn. "I had a horrible nightmare last night. I was at the airport again, with the fire, the sirens, and that shadow." I couldn't see what it was, but it was coming towards me, said Laura, her voice shaking a little. Jake was silent for a moment. He too had had the same nightmare. It couldn't be a coincidence. Laura, I had that nightmare too, he said at last. Exactly the same? They were both in shock. It was too frightening to think that they were dreaming the same thing. There was something strange going on, and now it was impossible to ignore. Jake knew that they needed to understand what was going on. Over the next few days, the nightmares continued, always with the same scene. The burning airport, the approaching shadow, and the terror of not being able to escape. Laura couldn't sleep properly either. Every time she closed her eyes, it was as if she was being pulled back into that hell. Jake, increasingly restless, started looking for answers. He searched for news about the fire, tried to find explanations for what they were experiencing, but nothing made sense. The official report said that the cause of the fire was still unknown, and investigations were ongoing. But that wasn't enough. He knew that the fire was only part of the story. There was something bigger and more dangerous behind it all. Laura, on the other hand, was trying to deal with the situation in another way. She went through her airport photos obsessively, hoping to find some clue. Every time she looked at that blurry image of the shadow, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It seemed that the figure in the photo was watching her back. Every day, the tension grew. Jake and Laura were no longer just dealing with the trauma of a fire. Now, it was as if something was following them, something that was getting closer and closer, invading their minds while they slept. And the scariest thing was that they knew they weren't alone. The days passed, and Jake continued to have the nightmares. Tiredness was starting to affect his life. At work, he felt distracted, unable to focus on any task for long. But on top of that, something strange began to happen to the people around him. In the office, his co-workers started acting differently. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. They seemed more distant, cold. People who used to talk to him over coffee now completely ignored him. It was as if he was invisible. One day, while Jake was in the building's cafeteria, he tried to talk to Mark, a colleague he used to have lunch with. But when he approached him, Mark looked at him strangely, as if he didn't recognize him. "Hi, Mark, what's up?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. Mark stood still for a second, staring at Jake as if he were a stranger. "Oh yeah, fine," Mark finally replied, but his voice was apathetic and motionless. He walked away without saying another word, leaving Jake with an uncomfortable feeling. Over the next few days, this feeling only got worse. Other co-workers began to act the same way. Strange, distant, as if they were there but not there at the same time. Jake began to feel that he was being watched all the time, even when no one seemed to be looking directly at him. Meanwhile, Laura also began to notice changes around her. Her friends, who used to always be available to chat and hang out, started canceling dates or simply not answering her calls. The last time she tried to meet a friend, the conversation was short and awkward, as if there was an invisible barrier between them. Laura felt the same discomfort as Jake. People seemed different, as if something was controlling them, making them act in an automatic, soulless way. She didn't know what to think, but she knew it had started after the fire. One night, Jake called Laura to vent. "Laura, I think I'm going crazy. The people at my work are acting weird. It's like they're changed. I can't explain it, but I feel like something's wrong with them," said Jake, clearly nervous. "I'm going through it too," replied Laura. "My friends are weird. I don't know what's going on, but it seems we're not the only ones affected." They were both silent for a moment, trying to process everything. The fire, the nightmares, the people acting strangely. Nothing made sense. "Do you think this has anything to do with what happened at the airport?" Jake asked, finally breaking the silence. "I don't know, but it all seems to be connected somehow," replied Laura, her voice full of uncertainty. Jake knew that they needed to find out what was going on before things got even worse. Laura could no longer ignore the feeling that the fire at the airport had triggered something bigger, something that was beyond her comprehension. Determined to find answers, she started researching the airport's past. Perhaps there was something that linked the place to strange events like the one she and Jake were experiencing. She spent hours on the internet, reading about the airport's history and previous events. At first, she found nothing unusual. Everything seemed ordinary. But after a while, Laura came across an old article from over 30 years ago, which talked about another fire at the same airport. At the time, the cause had also been mysterious, and few people had survived. Curiously, the fire 3 decades ago had occurred in almost the same place and under the same circumstances. Lara got goosebumps. As she read more, she discovered that, over the years, there had been rumors that the airport had been built on land with a dark past. According to some stories, before it became an airport, the site was an old field where strange and unexplained events took place. Nobody knew for sure what it was, but some people believed that the place was cursed. Lara felt her heart racing. This didn't seem like a coincidence. She knew she had to tell Jake. Meanwhile, Jake continued to deal with the strange behavior of the people around him. He tried to keep to a routine, but it was hard to concentrate with the constant feeling of being watched. The nights were the worst. Even at home, he felt there was something in the darkness, watching his every move. One night, while he was trying to sleep, Jake heard a sound coming from the kitchen. It was a soft noise, as if someone was opening a drawer. He knew he was alone, but the sound continued. Slowly, he got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, but when he got there, everything was in order. No drawers open, no sign that anything had been moved. He was beginning to doubt his own sanity. The next day, Lara called Jake, eager to share what she had discovered. "Jake, you won't believe what I've found," she said, wasting no time. "Tell me, what is it?" Jake asked, already nervous. "I found out that there was another fire at the airport over 30 years ago. The story is very similar to ours. No one has ever found out what caused it, and some people say the place is cursed," Lara explained, while Jake listened in silence. "Cursed?" Jake repeated, trying to process it. "Do you think this has anything to do with what we're going through?" "I don't know, but everything seems to be connected. I don't think the fire we experienced was an accident. There may be something darker involved, something that started long before us," Lara replied seriously. Jake didn't know what to think, but the feeling that something had been wrong since the fire was only growing. The clues were starting to come together, and he knew they needed to investigate further. What started at the airport wasn't over. Jake and Lara were more determined than ever to understand what was going on. The information Lara had found about the previous fire and the stories about the airport site being cursed had them both worried. They knew they couldn't face this alone, so they decided to get in touch with the other survivors. Jake started calling some of the people he had exchanged numbers with on the day of the fire. At first, no one answered. He thought that maybe they were busy or trying to forget the trauma, but as the days went by, the lack of response began to seem strange. Lara also tried to contact the people she met during the evacuation. She sent messages and left messages, but the silence was the same. After several attempts, she finally managed to speak to a woman called Amanda, who had been at the same gate as her on the day of the fire. "Amanda, it's Lara. We met at the airport, remember?" began Lara, hoping that the woman would remember her. "Yes, I remember," Amanda replied, but her voice sounded distant, almost as if she was distracted. "Since that day, something strange has been happening to us. Me and Jake, another survivor, are trying to understand. Have you had any similar experiences?" Lara asked, trying to be careful. Amanda was silent for a moment, and Lara heard a faint sigh on the other end of the line. "I can't talk about it," Amanda finally said, her voice low. "Something's wrong, but the more I think about it, the worse things get. I just want to forget." Before Lara could answer, the call dropped. She tried to call back, but couldn't get through. Something in Amanda's voice made her even more uneasy. Meanwhile, Jake kept trying to talk to other survivors, but with little luck. Finally, he managed to arrange a meeting with a man called David, who had also escaped the fire. They met in a cafe, and David seemed visibly shaken. "Since that day, nothing's been right," said David, nervously fiddling with his coffee cup. "I see things, I hear voices, and it's not just the nightmares. There's something chasing me, and I know I'm not going mad." Jake felt a chill. He and Lara were going through the same thing, but hearing someone else confirm their experiences made it all the more real and frightening. "Have you spoken to anyone else?" Jake asked, curious to know if the other survivors were in the same situation. David shook his head. "I tried, but many have disappeared. I know something happened to them. Nobody just disappears." Jake swallowed. He knew David was right. Things weren't normal. and now it seemed that the survivors of the fire were being erased somehow. When Jake told Lara about his conversation with David, they both began to realize that they were running out of time. More and more, it seemed that someone or something was trying to erase any evidence of what really happened at the airport. And, most frighteningly, they knew they were next on the list. Jake and Lara were getting more and more scared. After everything they had discovered about the fire and the strange behavior of the other survivors, they knew that something dangerous was surrounding them. It was no longer just paranoia or nightmares. There was a real, invisible presence that seemed to be behind them. One night, while Jake was at home, he felt that sensation of being watched again. He was sitting on the sofa with the television on, but he couldn't pay attention to what was on. Every sound in the house seemed to be amplified. The wind outside, the creaking of furniture, and the faint sound of footsteps. Jake froze. He was alone in the house, but he knew he wasn't really alone. He got up slowly and walked to the kitchen. When he entered, there was total silence. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. But before he could do anything, he felt a presence behind him. The air around him seemed heavier, as if something was surrounding him. Jake turned quickly, but saw nothing. Even so, fear gripped him. He knew it wasn't just his imagination. It was really happening. That same evening, Lara was in her apartment, trying to organize her thoughts. The phone rang, and she answered it without thinking. On the other end of the line, she heard heavy breathing, but no one spoke. Lara sat still, waiting, her heart racing. Finally, a voice whispered something, but it was so low that she couldn't understand it. Then the call dropped. She stared at the phone, her body trembling. It was as if the darkness itself was trying to speak to her. She knew she couldn't go on ignoring what was happening. The next morning, Jake and Lara met at a cafe, as they had agreed. They were both pale and exhausted. They looked like they hadn't slept at all. "I felt something last night," said Jake, breaking the silence. "I can't explain it, but there was something in my house. I heard footsteps, felt a presence, and when I turned around, I didn't see anything, but I knew it was there." Lara nodded, her face serious. "So did I. I got a strange call. I don't know who it was, but the voice, it sounded like it was whispering something, as if it wanted to warn me or scare me." They were both silent for a moment, trying to understand what they were facing. "This isn't normal, Jake," said Lara at last. "I think there's something following us, something we can't see. But it's there, and it's getting stronger." Jake agreed. He knew she was right. The feeling of being hunted, watched, wasn't just an irrational fear. It was real. And worst of all, they didn't know how to fight it, because the enemy was invisible. As they left the cafe, they realized that they could no longer ignore what was happening. Every day, things got more intense, more frightening. If they didn't do something soon, they had the feeling that this enemy would find them, and there would be no escape. The question now was, what was really chasing them? And how could they protect themselves from something they couldn't even see? With the feeling of being hunted and the growing fear, Jake and Lara knew they had to act quickly. What was happening to them was increasingly real and dangerous. They decided that the next step would be to dig deep into the airport's past, in the hope of finding some clue that would explain what they were facing. The next day, Lara went to the city's historical records office. She needed old information about the land on which the airport was built. The office was quiet and a little dusty, with files that looked decades old. Lara approached an employee who was there, a middle-aged man called Tom. "Hello, I'd like to research old records about the land on which the airport was built. I've heard of some strange events that happened there before it was an airport," Lara explained. Tom looked at her with curiosity and a little skepticism. "This is old ground. Many reports are just rumors. But I can help you find some historical documents," he said, starting to look through the archives. Meanwhile, Jake decided to check out the information Lara had found about the fire 30 years ago. He went to the local library, where he found a section dedicated to old newspapers. With the help of a librarian, he began to examine the issues of the time. The yellowed and worn pages showed reports about the fire, but the information was scarce. After a few hours of research, Lara found documents that revealed a little more about the land. There were records that before being a camp, the site had been a mining area where several mysterious deaths had occurred due to unexplained accidents. The story spoke of a former miner John Blake, who had disappeared under strange circumstances. Most of the workers at the time believed that Blake had been the victim of a curse. Lara felt a chill run down her spine. That story seemed to fit with what they were facing. She took the documents to Jake in the library, where he was going through old reports. "Jake, I found something," said Lara, placing the papers on the table. The land had a dark past. There were mysterious deaths and even a curse. This could be linked to what we're going through. Jake looked at the documents, his face showing a mixture of skepticism and concern. "It's too much of a coincidence," he said, examining the information. "But at the same time, we seem to be connected to this story in some way. The feeling of being watched, the strange behavior of the people. Everything is pointing to something that started long before us." They spent the rest of the day discussing their findings and trying to connect the dots. It was clear that there was something else in the land's past that was influencing the present. The fire, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched. Everything seemed to be connected to this ancient curse. "We need to find out more about this miner, John Blake," suggested Lara. "If he's somehow connected to what's happening, maybe we can find a way to stop it." Jake agreed, determined to understand what was behind this ancient curse. They knew that time was running out and that they needed to find a solution quickly. With each passing day, the invisible presence seemed to become more intense and more threatening. Their journey was just beginning, and the mystery of the past seemed more complex than they had ever imagined. Lara could hardly breathe as she read the aged pages about the cursed land and the mysterious deaths linked to the miner John Blake. Sitting in the library next to Jake, they both shared the feeling that they had stumbled upon something much bigger than they had imagined. It was as if each piece of the story fitted into a sinister puzzle, revealing a terrifying truth. "This John Blake," Jake began, nervously fiddling with the old newspaper. "He disappeared without a trace. People spoke of a curse, but what if he's still out there somehow?" Lara swallowed. The idea seemed absurd, but everything they were living through was already surreal. "That could be it," she replied. "Maybe the fire at the airport was part of some kind of ritual, or the entity that's following us has something to do with Blake. It could be that he's awakened, or that." Lara hesitated, almost unable to believe what she was about to say. "Maybe the fire released something that had been trapped for decades." Jake was silent for a few seconds, absorbing the theory. The oppressive feeling of being stalked, the recurring nightmares, the bizarre behavior of the people around him. Everything seemed to point to something much deeper and more sinister than a simple fire. "That makes sense in a scary way," Jake said, turning to Lara. "What if the fire at the airport was the catalyst? Something was dormant, and the fire was what woke it up. But who or what caused it?" Lara frowned, lost in thought. Then she remembered something she had read. She quickly flipped through the yellowed pages until she found a paragraph she hadn't paid much attention to before. "Here," she said, pointing to the text. "Blake is said to have been involved in ancient rituals, something he brought back from the depths of the mines. The workers believed that he had made a pact with dark forces to escape death in one of the cave-ins." Lara looked at Jake, her hands trembling slightly. What if he really did make that pact? What if the fire at the airport was a second pact, or an attempt to free him for good? Jake rubbed his face with his hands. The idea was disturbing, but it seemed to fit more and more with the strange experiences they had lived through. He thought of the shadow he had seen in the flames, the voices he had heard in the silence of his house. Everything led him to believe that something very old and dangerous had been released. "We need to find out what it has unleashed and how we can stop it," Jake said at last. And quickly, Lara nodded, but her eyes were still fixed on the documents. She found another line that made her uneasy. "Look at this." She pointed to an almost erased part of the text. "Some believe that Blake's pact did not free him, but bound him to this place, cursing the land forever. Any attempt to rebuild on the cursed ground would result in inexplicable disasters." "That explains the fires," Jake muttered. "Maybe the airport is cursed because of Blake, and now we're trapped in that curse too." Lara closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. They were fighting something invisible, something that didn't follow the rules of the physical world. But if they wanted to survive, they would have to face it somehow. "We need to get back to the airport," she said suddenly. Jake looked at her in surprise. "Back?" he asked, confused. Why? Because if there's any chance of us breaking this curse, the only place we can find answers is there. At the point of origin, Lara replied, with determination in her voice. We need to investigate what's left of the airport, find some clue that will tell us how to stop this entity or Blake's spirit, whatever it is that's haunting us. Jake hesitated, but he knew Lara was right. The only way to put an end to all this would be to go back to where it all began. Even if fear consumed them, they had to face their worst fears if they wanted to survive. Let's go then, Jake said, sighing heavily. But we need to be prepared for what we find. Lara smiled slightly, but the fear was still there, clear in her eyes. They knew that returning to the airport meant entering the enemy's lair. But with the entity growing stronger every day, there was no more time to lose. Jake and Lara decided to face whatever was chasing them. There was no longer any way to escape the signs, the nightmares, or the strange things happening around them. Every day, it seemed, the entity grew stronger, and they knew they couldn't escape forever. When they arrived at the airport, the place was still surrounded by the marks of the fire. The smell of burning hung in the air, and everything was silent. The large glass doors were cracked, and part of the ceiling had collapsed. It was as if the place had been frozen in time since the day it all began. Lara looked around, trying to understand what awaited them. She felt a weight in the air, something that made her skin crawl. Jake, next to her, was also nervous, but tried to stay calm. There's something here, I can feel it, said Lara, her voice low. So can I, replied Jake. We need to find out what it is and fast. They walked slowly through the empty lobby, their footsteps echoing in the deserted space. The feeling that they were being watched never left them. It seemed that at any moment, something might appear out of nowhere. But for the time being, the place remained quiet. As they advanced, Lara began to hear a distant sound. It was low, almost a whisper, but it was there. She stopped for a moment and looked at Jake. Do you hear that? She asked nervously. Jake nodded. He could hear it too. It was as if voices were calling out to them from somewhere deep inside the airport. We need to follow that sound, said Jake, tightening his pace. Lara hesitated, but knew he was right. The sound, strange as it was, seemed to be leading them to something important. They followed it until they reached a part of the airport that had been completely sealed off by the fire. Smoke had stained the walls and floors, and the place looked even darker and gloomier. Jake and Lara stopped in front of a large metal door, almost completely destroyed. It was there that the sound got louder. Suddenly, the voices stopped and silence took over again. Jake looked at Lara and she nodded. It was time to go in. As they pushed open the door, they felt a cold, strange wind pass through them, as if the air itself were alive. On the other side, a large room that had once looked like a warehouse was completely empty, except for one thing. In the center floated a dark figure, a form that looked human, but at the same time wasn't. Jake felt his blood run cold. Jake felt his blood run cold. The entity they had been dreading was there, in front of them. It had no face, but its presence was overwhelming. It was as if the air around her was heavy, dense, making it difficult for them to breathe. So that's it, murmured Lara, almost without a voice. The entity seemed to be watching them, even though it had no eyes. Around her, the environment began to distort and reality seemed to bend. The walls began to shake and the floor seemed to disappear little by little. Jake, what do we do? Lara asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't know what to say. They had expected to find something, but not like this, so real and so threatening. He took a step forward, trying to stay calm, but before he could say anything, the entity moved. It didn't walk, but glided through the air like a living shadow. And then the voices came again. But this time, they weren't distant. They were in their heads, whispering their worst fears, their insecurities, their guilt. You can't stop me, said the entity, without moving its mouth. The voice echoed inside their minds, making them tremble. Jake felt a wave of panic spread through his body. He knew they weren't prepared to face it. But at the same time, something inside him said that they couldn't run away. They had to find a way to resist, to understand how to defeat that force. With trembling hands, Lara reached for her camera, almost by instinct. She knew that the entity was not ordinary, but there was something inside her that told her she needed to record what was happening. When she looked through the lens, she saw something she hadn't seen before. The figure of the entity seemed to be connected to something on the ground. A symbol, engraved in the stones, emitted a weak, almost imperceptible light. "Jake, look at that!" she shouted, pointing at the symbol. Jake looked, and for a second, he felt a surge of hope. That could be the key. That symbol, it's connected to her, said Lara. Maybe that's what's keeping her here. Jake agreed. They needed to find out what that symbol meant and how to use it to undo the entity's power. But before they could act, the dark figure advanced quickly, and their surroundings began to crumble into shadows and screams. "We need to get out of here," shouted Jake, grabbing Lara by the arm. They ran as fast as they could, while the entity chased them, its nightmarish voices echoing around them. They left the room, almost tripping over the debris. The air was heavy, and the entity's presence seemed closer by the second. But for some reason, it couldn't get through the metal door they had crossed. Jake and Lara stopped, panting in the corridor. The entity had disappeared from sight, but they knew it was waiting. And now, they knew they didn't have much time. They needed to go back, find out more about that symbol, and, above all, find a way to use it against the entity before it was too late. The danger wasn't over, but now, they had a clue, and that was all they needed to keep fighting. Jake and Lara ran through the dark corridors of the airport, still feeling the presence of the entity behind them, even if it wasn't visible. The air around them felt heavy, almost as if they were swimming against an invisible tide. Their hearts were racing, and the adrenaline was driving them forward. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, panting. "We can't face it like this. We're unprepared." Lara agreed, fear in her eyes. They had escaped from the room where the entity appeared, but they knew they couldn't run forever. Sooner or later, they would have to go back and face whatever was haunting the place. But for now, they needed to run and come up with a plan. As they ran, the emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Each sound echoed through the empty corridors, amplifying the feeling that something was lurking around every bend. How did she appear so suddenly? Lara asked, still trying to process what they had seen. And that symbol, why did it seem connected to her? "I don't know, but I think the symbol has something to do with her power," Jake replied without slowing down. "It could be the key to understanding how to defeat her. But we need to find out what it means." As they approached the exit, they both began to feel a slight hope that they could leave the airport behind, at least for a while. However, as soon as they reached the large glass doors, a strange sound echoed through the lobby. It was like the sound of metal scratching stone, a vibration that made them both stop instantly. "What was that?" Lara asked, her voice low and hesitant. Jake looked around, trying to identify the source of the sound. Before they could react, the glass doors in front of them closed with a bang, sealing the exit. The entity, although invisible, was clearly controlling the environment around them. "It's not going to let us out," Jake muttered, feeling his panic rise. They tried to push the doors, but they wouldn't budge. Lara knocked on the windows, but it was as if an invisible force had locked them for good. The exit was blocked, and the entity, even though it didn't appear, seemed to be everywhere, manipulating the airport as it saw fit. "We're trapped here," Lara said, her voice shaking. "She wants us here. She's toying with us." Jake replied, still trying to stay calm. "But she wants something. If she really wanted to get us, she would have done it by now. Maybe she wants to scare us, to weaken us," Lara suggested. "Maybe that's part of her power?" Jake was silent for a moment, thinking. It made sense. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, the nightmares, the voices, the apparitions. It stalked them, but never attacked directly. Perhaps that's what gave it its strength. "We need to keep our heads on straight," Jake said, turning to Lara. "If it feeds on our fear, we can't let it win. We have to keep going." Lara nodded, trying to pull herself together. She knew Jake was right, but it was still hard to control her growing fear. They walked back down the corridor, looking for another exit, but the airport seemed to change around them. The path they had taken before now looked different, as if the walls had shifted. Every door they tried was locked, every corridor took them back to where they started. It was as if the entity was playing with their minds, making it clear that they had nowhere to run. "It doesn't make sense," Jake exclaimed in frustration. "It's as if it's trapping us here on purpose, as if it wants us to get lost." Lara looked around, noticing that the atmosphere was different, almost as if the airport was alive, changing in front of them. Time seemed distorted, and every step they took seemed to take them deeper into the place, rather than closer to an exit. "Maybe the only way out is to go back to where it all began," said Lara, with a tone of resignation. Jake looked at her, confused. "Go back to that room?" he asked. "The room where we saw the entity?" "Yes," Lara replied. "We can't keep running. It controls this place, and the more we run, the more lost we become. We have to face it somehow." Jake knew she was right. Running was no use anymore. They needed to find answers, and maybe, by confronting the entity directly, they could figure out a way to stop it. "Right, so let's go back," he said, trying to gather his courage. "But this time, let's go prepared." With the decision made, Jake and Lara began to retrace their steps back to the room where they had found the entity. The airport seemed less chaotic now, as if the entity had been waiting patiently for their return. As they walked, they both knew they were entering a life-or-death battle. The entity was getting stronger, and they still didn't have all the answers. But now, they had a clear focus, finding out what was holding it there and how to destroy it before it was too late. Jake and Lara walked slowly back to the room where they had first encountered the entity. Every step they took seemed harder, as if the ground itself was dragging against them. The air around them was heavy and icy, as if the entity knew they were approaching. "We have to stay calm," said Jake, trying to sound confident, even though fear was growing inside him. "We can't let fear control us." Lara nodded, clutching her camera tightly. She didn't know why she had brought the camera, but it seemed like the only familiar thing in all the chaos. As they walked through the corridors, she tried to concentrate, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The way back seemed longer than the first time. The airport kept changing. The corridors stretched out and shadows danced on the walls. Lara had the feeling that she was being watched all the time, as if invisible eyes were following her. Finally, they reached the metal door of the room. The voices had stopped, and the silence was almost worse. Lara looked at Jake, who nodded. They knew there was no turning back. "Are you ready?" Jake asked. Lara took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. "I am," she replied, her voice firm, although the fear was clear in her eyes. Jake pushed open the door, and they entered the room once more. The atmosphere seemed even darker and scarier than before. The symbol on the floor, the same one Lara had photographed, glowed faintly, as if it were alive. In the center of the room, the entity was back. The dark form floated slowly, like a faceless shadow, but its presence was overwhelming. The room seemed to shrink around it, as if the entity was sucking in all the light and energy. "You've come back," said the entity's cold, sinister voice, echoing directly in their minds. "You can't run away from me." Jake felt a shiver run through his body. It was as if the entity's voice was inside him, stirring his emotions, trying to awaken the deepest dread. He knew they couldn't let fear win. "We're here to put an end to this," Jake said, trying to sound confident, although his voice trembled a little. The entity laughed, a sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room at the same time. "Do you think you could beat me?" It mocked. "I'm part of this place. I'm part of you now." Lara stepped forward, camera in hand, and looked at the symbol on the floor. The faint glow seemed to pulsate, as if it were connected to the entity in some way. She knew that this symbol was important, that it might be the key to freeing them. "Jake, the symbol," she whispered. Jake looked down at the ground and saw what Lara was pointing to. He slowly approached the symbol, trying to understand its meaning. When he got close enough, he felt a wave of energy run through his body, as if the symbol were alive. "It's connected to her," Jake said, almost in disbelief. "This symbol is what keeps her here." Lara looked at the entity, which continued to float in the air, watching their every move. "What do we do now?" Lara asked, desperate. Jake looked around, searching for something that could help them destroy the symbol, but there was nothing in the room. He felt his desperation growing. How could they defeat something so powerful? The entity seemed to realize what they were trying to do and began to move slowly towards them. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and the walls of the room seemed to close in, making the space smaller and smaller. "You can't stop me," shouted the entity, its voice getting louder and louder, filling the space with an oppressive energy. Jake and Lara stepped back, feeling the dread intensify. But Lara didn't want to give up. She knew there was a way to break the entity's power. She looked at her camera again, an idea popping into her mind. The symbol is a link, but it is also connected to our minds, to our fears, said Lara, her eyes wide. "What if we use it against her?" "What do you mean?" Jake asked, confused. Lara started fiddling with the camera, adjusting the focus to the symbol on the floor. She knew that the entity fed off their fear, but perhaps if she captured the essence of the symbol, she could break that connection. "Maybe if I can capture the symbol with the camera, we can sever its link with this place," Lara explained quickly. "It's worth a try," Jake replied, still unsure but ready to try anything. Lara knelt on the floor and pointed the camera at the symbol, trying to keep her hands steady as the room seemed to shake around her. The entity advanced, getting closer and closer, the darkness around it increasing. When Lara took the picture, the camera's flash briefly illuminated the room. At the same moment, the entity let out a high-pitched scream, which echoed around the room. The symbol on the floor glowed brightly, and then the light disappeared. For a moment, the air became heavy and still, as if time had stopped. Jake and Lara looked at the entity, which now seemed less solid, weaker. "What's happening?" Jake asked in disbelief. "I think it worked," Lara replied hopefully. "It's losing strength." But before they could celebrate, the entity let out one last angry cry and disappeared into the shadows of the room. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the symbol on the floor cracked, releasing a black energy that surged through the walls, as if the airport itself was falling apart. "We need to get out of here," shouted Jake, pulling Lara out of the room. They ran as fast as they could, while the airport seemed to crumble around them. The entity was weakened, but they knew it wasn't defeated. They would still have to face the entity again, but at least now they had a chance. Jake and Lara ran out of the room, panting and full of adrenaline. The floor still shook slightly, and the walls seemed distorted, as if the airport was caught between two different realities. They knew that the entity had been weakened, but not destroyed. Now, they needed to understand what was really going on. "What was that all about?" Jake asked, out of breath. The entity got weaker, but it's still here. Lara was confused, but something was bothering her. The camera was still in her hands, and the image of the symbol she had captured seemed important somehow. She opened the screen to check the photo, and as she looked at it, her heart almost stopped. The image showed something strange, something that wasn't visible to the naked eye. "Jake, look at this," said Lara, turning the camera towards him. In the photo, in addition to the symbol, there was a kind of invisible portal, a crack in the air, as if there was another dimension hidden inside that room. It was a dark opening, full of shadows and distorted lights, which seemed to move and change shape. That wasn't there before," Jake exclaimed, shocked. "What is it?" "I don't know, but it seems that this place is connected to something beyond our reality," replied Lara, still incredulous. "Maybe that's what the entity is trying to show us. It doesn't belong to our world." Jake was silent for a moment, trying to process everything. If the entity came from another dimension, that would explain why it seemed so powerful and why the airport was trapped in something they couldn't fully understand. "We have to investigate," said Jake, although he knew that the idea of entering a place like that was terrifying. If the entity is connected to this other dimension, maybe that's where we can find out how to really defeat it. Lara looked at the photo again. The portal was clearer there, but in the real world, it was as if it were hidden, almost invisible. She knew it was a huge risk, but she also felt that they had no choice. "If we go in, we can find a way to put an end to this," Lara said with determination. Carefully, they went back into the room. The air was strange, colder than before, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord. They approached the place where the symbol was cracked, and suddenly the invisible portal began to reveal itself, as if it knew they were near. Without much thought, Jake and Lara looked at each other and took the next step. As soon as they stepped through the crack, They felt a strong pressure around them, as if the air were denser. The sensation was uncomfortable, and their ears were ringing. They didn't know where they were going, but they were already inside. On the other side, the atmosphere was strange, almost unreal. It looked like the airport, but everything was distorted. The walls had wavy shapes, and the floor moved slightly under their feet, as if they were walking on a living surface. The colors were also different, darker, and with tones that seemed impossible in the real world. "Where are we?" Lara asked, looking around. Her voice echoed as if space were empty. "I don't know, but it's not our world," Jake replied, also startled. This must be the dimension of the entity. They walked slowly, trying to understand where they were. Everything around them seemed deserted, but there was a constant feeling that something was watching them, hidden in the shadows. The silence was total, except for the faint sounds that the environment itself made, like a distant hum. Suddenly, Lara stopped. She saw something ahead, a figure, which seemed to be moving slowly towards them. Jake looked too, and, to his surprise, realized that it was a distorted version of himself. The figure had Jake's features, but its eyes were completely dark, and its skin looked gray, as if it were dead. Is that me?" Jake said, unable to believe his eyes. Before they could react, more figures began to appear, each representing a dark version of people they knew, and even Lara. It was as if they were seeing distorted reflections of their own lives, but corrupted by some unknown force. "Are these things part of the entity?" Lara asked, taking a step back. "I think they are. They must be manifestations of our fear," Jake replied, trying to remain calm. The shadowy figures slowly began to surround them, their distorted forms emitting a sense of deep dread. Jake and Lara knew they couldn't let fear take over, or they would be completely vulnerable to the entity. "We can't let ourselves get carried away. They're just illusions," shouted Lara, trying to convince herself. They ran, trying to get away from the figures. The world around them seemed to twist and turn, becoming more and more chaotic. The walls of the alternative airport were shaking, and the shadows were growing, making everything even more frightening. Finally, they reached an open space, where the symbol they had seen in the real world was once again on the ground, but this time, shining brightly. It seemed to be the center of everything, the heart of that dimension. "This is the point of origin," Jake exclaimed. "If we can destroy it here, maybe we can put an end to the entity once and for all." Lara looked around. She knew they were close to something important, but also that the entity wouldn't let them destroy its power without a fight. They would have to prepare for an even bigger confrontation. The other side was a place of shadows and fears, but now Jake and Lara had a chance to fight. And they knew they would need all their strength to defeat the entity and return to the real world before it was too late. Jake and Lara slowly approached the glowing symbol on the ground. The light it emitted was strong, almost blinding, and it seemed to pulsate, as if it were alive. They knew that this was the heart of the strange dimension they had entered. The symbol was the source of the entity's power, but it was also the key to defeating it. "We need to destroy it," Jake said, his voice low but firm. Lara nodded. She also felt that the symbol was the entity's link to their world. If they could destroy it, perhaps they could weaken it for good. But before they could take any steps, the shadowy figures that had been chasing them reappeared. They emerged from the shadows, surrounding them with distorted faces and dark eyes. They seemed more numerous and aggressive than before, as if they knew that Jake and Lara were close to achieving something. "They're not going to let us destroy the symbol," said Lara, taking a step backwards, her heart racing. "We need to move fast," Jake replied, clenching his fists. He looked around, trying to find a way past the shadowy figures. Suddenly, one of the shadows lunged at Jake, trying to grab him. He managed to dodge it, but fell to the ground, feeling the impact. Lara ran to help him, but more shadows were advancing, as if to prevent any movement. "We're not going to make it alone," Lara shouted, feeling her dread grow. Jake stood up with difficulty, sweat dripping down his face. The shadows were getting closer and closer, and time seemed to be running out. There was no way they could defeat all those creatures and destroy the symbol at the same time. It was an impossible situation. It was then that one of the other survivors appeared in the room. It was David, one of the passengers who had escaped the fire with them. Lara and Jake recognized him immediately, but something was different about him. David seemed more determined, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "David, what are you doing here?" Jake asked, surprised as he struggled to stand up. David looked at the symbol on the floor and then at the shadows that surrounded them. "I know what needs to be done," he said, his voice calm but full of resignation. Lara and Jake were confused. They didn't understand what David meant, but the look on his face made it clear that he had made an important decision. "We don't have time," David continued. "The entity is linked to this symbol, to this dimension. It feeds on our fear and pain. But to really weaken it, someone has to sacrifice themselves. Someone has to break the link from within." Lara looked at him, shocked. "What's that? Are you talking about sacrificing yourself?" she asked, incredulous. David nodded with a sad smile. "I already know I'm not going to get out of here. Ever since the fire, I feel like something has tied me to this place. My nights are filled with nightmares, and the entity is hunting me. I can't go on living like this, but you still have a chance. If I give myself up, I can weaken the entity enough for you to destroy the symbol." Jake and Lara were silent, not knowing what to say. The thought of losing someone was horrible, but David seemed certain that this was the only way to win. "No. Is there any other way?" Jake asked, his voice full of despair. David shook his head. "There is no other way out. But if you do what needs to be done, she won't be able to hunt us down anymore." "I'm ready for that." Lara and Jake exchanged a look. They didn't want to accept it, but they knew David was right. He was sacrificing himself for them, for all the survivors. It was the only way to weaken the entity enough for them to have a chance of destroying it for good. "Thank you, David," said Lara, with tears in her eyes. David just smiled slightly and walked over to the symbol on the floor. As he approached, the shadows began to retreat, as if they knew what was about to happen. The light from the symbol grew stronger, illuminating the whole room, and David knelt in the center of the drawing, his eyes closed. "Remember, destroy the symbol after I'm gone," he said, his voice calm, even in the face of what was about to happen. Lara and Jake watched in silence as a strong energy enveloped David. The light around him became so intense that they had to cover their eyes. Then, in one last blinding flash, David disappeared. The air fell silent. The shadows surrounding Jake and Lara began to fade, as if they were losing strength. The entity that had once seemed so powerful was now weakened. "Now!" Jake shouted. Lara and Jake approached the symbol, which was still glowing faintly on the ground. With a precise blow, Jake hit the symbol with all his strength, and a crack spread across the floor. The light disappeared completely, and the symbol began to crumble. They had succeeded. David's sacrifice had weakened the entity, and the symbol that connected it to their world was destroyed. However, they both knew that the danger was not yet completely over. The entity was weakened, but not defeated. The final confrontation was yet to come. Lara and Jake took a deep breath, knowing that, despite the pain, the fight was not over. Jake and Lara stood in the center of the room, staring at the destroyed symbol on the floor. David's sacrifice had weakened the entity, and the symbol, which had once glowed with power, was now only a shadow of what it had been. Even so, they both knew that the fight wasn't over yet. The entity was somewhere, still watching them, waiting for its chance to retaliate. "We can still feel it," said Jake, looking around, waiting for some sign that the entity would appear again. "Yes, it's still here," replied Lara, her voice low and careful. "But it's weaker. We know that now. We have a chance to put an end to it for good." They couldn't let their guard down. Although the symbol was destroyed, the entity still had strength. They needed to find the true source of its power and destroy it completely, or else the cycle of fear and nightmares would continue. "I don't think the symbol was the complete source of her power. There's something else that's still linking the entity to this place," said Jake, thinking out loud. Lara, still holding her camera, began to remember everything they had been through up to that point. From the fire, the voices, the shadows, to the portal they had gone through. Everything pointed to a center of power, something that kept the entity trapped there and, at the same time, strong enough to continue haunting their lives. What if the real source of power is hidden somewhere else in the airport, Lara suggested. The symbol was controlling part of her energy, but perhaps there is something older, something deeper, that the entity is protecting. Jake thought for a moment, and suddenly it all seemed to make sense. The symbol was just a reflection of the greater energy behind it all. Perhaps the real relic, what really gave the entity its power, was hidden somewhere they hadn't yet discovered. "We need to look," said Jake. "If we find the real source, we can put an end to this once and for all." They left the room in silence, keeping an eye out for any sign of the entity. The airport continued to look distorted, the walls and corridors changing shape as they walked. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the darkness. As they explored the airport, Lara felt something strange in her mind, as if she was being pulled to a specific place. It was an uncomfortable sensation, but familiar at the same time. It was as if the entity was guiding them to its source, perhaps in a desperate attempt to protect it or use it against them. "I feel we're getting close," Lara said, looking at Jake. "Her presence is stronger here." Jake agreed, feeling the same way. The air around them seemed heavier, and the feeling of being watched increased by the minute. They followed a narrow corridor, with the lights flashing above their heads, until they found a locked metal door. "It must be here," said Jake, pointing to the door. With effort, they managed to force the door, which creaked before opening. Upon entering, they discovered an old, abandoned room that seemed to have been forgotten for decades. In the center of the room was a large, heavy box covered in dust and cobwebs. "What could that be?" asked Lara, approaching the box carefully. Jake, with Lara's help, opened the box. Inside, they found an ancient relic, something that seemed to belong to another era. It was a small stone statue, carved with strange and unknown symbols. The statue emanated a strange and disturbing energy, and just looking at it made their hearts race. "That must be the source of her power," said Jake, his eyes fixed on the relic. "It's what keeps her trapped here, and it's also what feeds her." Lara looked at the statue with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that destroying that relic was the only way to put an end to the entity for good. But there was a problem. The energy emanating from the statue was so strong that it seemed impossible to approach it without being affected. "We need to destroy it, but how?" asked Lara, without taking her eyes off the relic. Jake was silent for a moment, thinking. He knew they couldn't simply break the statue with brute force. The entity had too much power, and any direct attempt to destroy the relic could be dangerous. "Maybe we should use what we know about the entity against it," Jake said after a few seconds. "If it feeds on our fear, maybe that's what we need to break. We need to show that we're not afraid of it anymore." Lara understood what Jake meant. The entity had controlled their lives with fear and terror since the fire. If they could resist it, if they showed that they were no longer scared, perhaps they could weaken the relic's power even more. "Let's do this together," said Lara, taking Jake's hand. "Let's not let fear win." Their hearts racing, but with new courage, they approached the relic. The air around them began to vibrate, and the feeling of danger became even more intense. But this time, Lara and Jake didn't back down. They were ready to confront the entity and end the cycle once and for all. Holding each other's hands tightly, Jake and Lara looked directly at the relic, without looking away, without letting fear take over. They knew that this was the only way to break the connection between the entity and their world. The final confrontation was yet to come, but now they had something more powerful than any relic. The courage to face what terrified them and destroy the force that had controlled their lives. Now, the cycle was about to be broken. Jake and Lara stood in front of the relic, their hearts racing, but determined to put an end to the entity once and for all. The room seemed to breathe around them. The air moved strangely, as if it were alive, while the relic pulsed with a dark energy. The floor trembled slightly, and they knew that the entity was nearby, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Are we ready for this?" Lara asked, squeezing Jake's hand tightly. The fear was still there, but she knew they couldn't give up now. Jake took a deep breath, looking at the small statue in the center of the room. It was the key to everything, the source of the entity's power, and what kept it connected to their world. Destroying it was the only way to finally free themselves from this cycle of terror. "We have no choice, Lara," Jake replied, trying to remain calm. "It's now or never." As they prepared, a dark presence began to fill the room. The entity revealed itself, its dark, undefined form floating in the air. It seemed bigger, stronger than before, as if it knew it was in danger and was feeding on every drop of fear left in Jake and Lara. "Do you think you can destroy me?" The entity's voice echoed, filling the space with a deep bass sound. "I am stronger than anything you can imagine. I am fear, and you will never escape me." Jake and Lara felt a wave of dread spread through their bodies, but this time, they were ready. They knew that the entity was trying to break them, as it always did, using fear to strengthen itself. But now, they understood that they could only defeat it if they resisted that fear. "No, we're not running away anymore," said Lara, stepping forward. Her voice was firm, even if her hands were still shaking a little. "You feed off our fear, but we're not going to give it to you anymore," added Jake, his gaze fixed on the entity. "We will no longer allow you to control our lives." The entity laughed, a distorted, cold sound. "You're weak. You always have been." Its voice roared, as the room around it began to shake violently. "I am eternal, and you cannot defeat me." But Lara and Jake didn't back down. They knew the entity was bluffing, trying to make them believe it was invincible. But now, they could feel that, with the destruction of the relic, the entity was more vulnerable than ever. Slowly, Lara took the camera out of her backpack. She had used the camera before to capture parts of the entity's energy and the symbol. Perhaps the lens would be able to weaken the entity even more. "Let's do this together, Jake," said Lara, holding the camera in one hand and preparing to act. Jake nodded, knowing that this was the decisive moment. With one swift movement, Lara focused the camera lens directly on the relic, while Jake approached the statue, ready to destroy it for good. "You can't!" shouted the entity, its form shaking and distorting in the air. But Jake and Lara had already decided. The glow of the camera's flash illuminated the room for a brief moment, and the entity let out a high-pitched scream, as if it was being hit directly. At the same moment, Jake used all the strength he had and hit the relic with a piece of metal he had found on the floor. The statue cracked, and an explosion of light and shadow filled the room. The entity roared in pain, its form falling apart in the air. It was weakened, almost destroyed, but not yet completely defeated. Jake and Lara knew that this was the final moment, the last blow they needed to strike. "Now!" shouted Jake, as the relic disintegrated in his hands. Lara adjusted the camera one last time, taking another picture of what was left of the relic. The explosion of light was so strong that it blinded them for an instant. The entity let out one last desperate cry before disappearing completely, as if it had been erased from reality. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jake and Lara stood still for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. The entity that had tormented them for so long was finally gone. The cycle had been broken, but something still wasn't right. The room still seemed unstable, as if the very space around them was collapsing. The walls were shaking, and the floor was starting to crack. "I think we need to get out of here now," said Jake, pulling Lara by the hand. They ran as fast as they could, while the alternative airport shattered around them. The feeling of chaos was intense, but this time, they knew it wasn't the entity trying to scare them. The world around them was falling apart because the connection between the entity and the airport had been destroyed. They ran to the exit, passing through the corridors that were now crumbling to pieces. When they finally got through the door and back into the real world, they felt fresh, clean air filling their lungs. "We made it," said Jake, panting as he leaned against a wall. Lara smiled, relieved, but they both knew there was still a lot to process. The confrontation with the entity was over, but they had lost friends and faced deep fears. Now it was time to try and return to normal life. However, as they looked around, they still felt a slight tension in the air. The battle was won, but what would come next? Jake and Lara were finally outside the airport. The cool night air seemed surreal after everything they had been through. The dim lights of the city shone in the distance, and for a moment they felt as if the worst was over. They had survived the confrontation with the entity, broken the relic that kept it connected to the real world, and now they were free. "I think it's finally over," said Jake, still trying to catch his breath. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but he seemed lost in thought. "Yes," replied Lara, although her voice didn't carry the same certainty. She looked around, as if she was still waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. They sat down on the ground, tired but relieved. The airport, which had once seemed so threatening, was silent. There were no more tremors, voices, or shadows following them. But as much as they wanted to believe that it was all over, a nagging feeling remained, like a doubt that wouldn't go away. "What do you think is going to happen now?" Lara asked, breaking the silence. Jake took his time answering, thinking carefully about his words. "I don't know," he admitted. "We destroyed the relic and the entity, but after everything we've seen, it's hard to know if we're really free." Lara nodded. Even with the entity apparently destroyed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The nightmares, the voices, and the shadows. It had been too real to simply disappear without a trace. "Maybe we're free," she said, almost to convince herself. "Maybe we're just too scared to believe it." Jake remained silent, thinking about what Lara had said. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was all just an echo of the fear they still carried. But something inside him still seemed out of place, as if the story hadn't been completely resolved. After a while, they decided to go back to their lives. The fire and the supernatural events were things they would try to put behind them. Returning home, finding some normality, seemed the next logical step. A few days later, Jake was in his apartment, trying to get back into his routine. Work remained the same, but he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. At night, he still woke up sweating, remembering the nightmares and the feeling of being watched. But when he looked around, his house was empty. Everything was normal. Lara was also trying to move on. She started taking pictures again, but every time she looked through the lens, she felt that something was still lurking. In her photos, shadows sometimes appeared in the corners, and she wasn't sure if they were just plays of light or something more sinister. However, she tried to ignore it, telling herself that the danger was over. But one night, something strange happened. Jake was lying down, ready to go to sleep, when he heard a faint rustling in the room. He froze, recognizing the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His mind began to race, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind, or just his imagination. "It can't be," he muttered to himself, slowly getting up. He walked around the apartment, checking the windows and doors. Everything was locked. The silence returned, but the unease didn't go away. He went back to his room, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. That same night, Lara also felt something strange. While reviewing her most recent photos on the computer, an image caught her eye. It was a photograph she had taken of an ordinary street, but in the background there was a dark, almost imperceptible figure that seemed to be watching her. She blinked, trying to understand what she was seeing, but the figure disappeared when she looked again. She took a deep breath, feeling a wave of dread run up her spine. Could it still be here? Lara whispered to herself, quickly turning off the computer. Over the next few days, both Jake and Lara began to notice small signs that perhaps the cycle wasn't really broken. The fear, which they thought they had left behind, seemed to creep back, slowly, into their lives. Although the entity had been weakened and the relic destroyed, the feeling that something was still following them didn't leave them in peace. It was as if the shadow of what they had faced was still hanging over them, invisible but present. Perhaps what they faced could never be completely defeated, or perhaps fear itself was what really imprisoned them. Jake and Lara knew that even if they tried to return to normality, there would always be that lingering doubt. Was the entity still there, waiting to come back? The end of the battle seemed to have come, but true freedom was still an unanswered question. The cycle could have been broken, or perhaps it was just beginning again,